our nervous systems actually don't compare. Um, all they do is they experience the stress that can become trauma in the absence of a compassionate witness. What we long for, what our nervous systems long for, is not comparison but connection.
Hello, and welcome to the Shifting Culture podcast, in which we have conversations about the culture we create and the impact we can make. We long to see the body of Christ look like Jesus. I'm your host, Joshua Johnson. I stepped into the living room of a family that just came to a new country. They were escaping war. The husband just fled from a job that required torture. They had twin babies that died at 3 weeks old. This is big T trauma. I didn't know what to say. I felt like I had no place to step into their situation because I never experienced anything like they had to go through. But I became a compassionate presence. I was an empathetic listener to their story, and because of that, the healing process could go on. But if I am to be a listener, I also need to do the work of healing what's within myself. Because I can't react out of my own woundedness. I can't regulate my emotions by trying harder and trying to be significant. I need to reckon with my disconnection and move towards a more embodied connection with God, myself, others, and creation. In this episode, Chuck DeGroat, a professor of pastoral care and Christian spirituality at Western Theological Seminary, dives into the wounds we all carry and the journey of healing what's within. Chuck shares his own story of disconnection and isolation and how he learned to pay attention to the dashboard of his thoughts, emotions, body, behaviors, and relationships to uncover the deeper wounds beneath the surface. He unpacks the power of secure attachment and how we could find our way back to that sense of belonging, worth, and purpose, not just in our minds, but in our very bodies. Whether you're a high-capacity striver or someone that is just trying to survive, this conversation will invite you into a transformative process of becoming more grounded, regulated, and connected to yourself, others, and to the God who loves you. So get ready to lean in, because this is going to be a powerful and practical exploration of healing what's within. Here is my conversation with Chuck DeGroat. Chuck, welcome to Shifting Culture. Really excited to have you on. Thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, it's good to be with you.
I'm really excited about this book, Healing What's Within. We all have wounds. We all have things in our life which we actually don't take care of, we don't heal from. And a lot of people, when we think of trauma, we think of pretty big T trauma.
Yeah.
I worked with Syrian refugees, and so I worked with war refugees. I had to learn how to deal with, people coming out of a war zone and what to do with big T trauma. And I started to minimize my own wounding and my own pain and saying, well, look at them. They have it much worse than me. And so I would react out of my own wounds, and I didn't do the work in my own life. Does everybody have wounds? and do we all have things that we need to heal from?
Yeah. Well, I think the answer is yes. I think we're born into a world that, just think about how traumatic it is just to be born in the first place. You're in the safety of the womb, and you emerge into this scary, cold world with people in white lab coats and fluorescent lights. That's terrifying, actually. And I do think that there is this sense of this shift from the safety. It's analogous in some ways to the early Genesis story, the safety of Eden. And then Adam and Eve are sort of born into this world of shame and overwhelm and hiddenness and self-protection. I do think that there are wounds that all of us experience in one way or another, but they need not become traumatic wounds, in the sense that we all experience stress. To be human is to experience stress at some level, but stress that overwhelms our nervous systems becomes trauma. And oftentimes that's in the context of these things that happen to us that that are not met with compassion, you might say, are not met with a compassionate, the care of a compassionate friend or the attunement of a compassionate parent. And so, two children may go through a similar situation, but one may be attuned to by a compassionate parent and another one left to fend for herself. The first experiences stress, the second experiences trauma.
So then take us into, I know in the beginning of your book, you go into Genesis 3 and the questions that God asks Adam and Eve after they've taken from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Yeah.
And so what are those questions, and what are the two different ways that we can actually hear the questions from God?
Yeah, it's really interesting. Right before you and I got on, I was going back through old notes on my Mac, and I went all the way back to 2012 in a silent retreat that I led where I was beginning to use these questions. And years ago that I was wrestling through those early texts of Scripture, and I began to wonder, because I grew up in the Reformed tradition, and I'm still in what we would call here a more generously Reformed tradition. But what I grew up hearing was that this is the story of a great tragedy. This is how it all went wrong. And what I sensed was that God was probably really mad. And as I spent time with particularly that first question, where are you? And did some work around it, even work with the text, God walking in the cool of the day, probably the time of the day when he would walk with Adam and Eve, go on their daily walk. That God asking, where are you? That's the first question of the book of Lamentations in the Hebrew. It's a question of that comes out of grief and longing. I began to hear God's kindness. And I think what occurred to me was, in the midst of this moment of profound pain, because it's painful, right? And Adam and Eve discover they're naked. There's this sense of we need to cover up. They sow fig leaves. They hear God coming. They hide. God comes with, in my opinion, compassion and curiosity. God didn't have to come with a question. The Bible could have started in a different place. It could have been some sort of, how could you have done this? Well, that's a question too, I guess. But, you're so terrible. You've made a huge mistake. The kinds of things I've said as a dad, by the way. But there is this sense of brokenheartedness of, where are you? I miss you. We were having so much fun. We were going on long walks in the cool of the day. I miss us. I miss what we've experienced. And, one of the things I say in there that I think is kind of a well-accepted truism among trauma therapists is that disconnection is at the heart of trauma. And of course, disconnection and alienation are at the heart of Genesis 3 too.
I interviewed Elizabeth Oldfield, and she talks about sin as disconnection and wanting to get us back into connection. And I think that's a lot of the work that you're doing in here is bringing us back into connection with God and to ourselves and to others. And we isolate when we are hurt and wounded, and we actually disconnect from different things. Where has that happened in your own life, where you have decided to go the route of isolation, disconnection, rather than longing for more connection?
Yeah. How long do you have? And are you a licensed therapist, Josh?
Yeah, I charge by the hour, so we're good.
I think early on there was a pretty early wound of my dad worked weekdays, weeknights, and I only saw him on weekends, and so there's real kind of loss of connection to my dad that made me wonder. I didn't really get this until I was older, but maybe sort of wonder, like, does he love me? Does he want to be with me? I think my mom felt kind of overwhelmed, and I think in the midst of her overwhelm and some of her early trauma and addiction, we didn't often get the best of her. And that's painful to say. My mom passed away at almost 90 last summer. And, there was a lot of reconciliation later on, but there was some pain there, and I think as a young kid, I felt pretty lonely. I kind of felt like I was on my own, that I had to go it on my own. And, there are things in life that reinforce that. One big thing that happened to me is I was fired from my first job in ministry in the midst of a clash with a senior pastor. And I very much came out of that with a sense I guess I've got to forge my own path. I had this sense that that would doom me in the future to future pastoral jobs, that perhaps the word would get out that somehow, some way I wasn't hireable. And I very much felt like I guess I'm on my own. And the interesting thing there, and I think I reflect on this a little bit in the book, is people were saying to me, wow, you're so resilient. You've really come out of this stronger, better. But inside, I was ashamed. I had pulled away. I was coping in ways that I think were harmful to me and sabotaging to my relationships. And it really took. I mean, it took almost a decade. I mean, I ended up in a hospital bed in Mexico. I think the phrase, the body keeps the score, right? My body kept the score amidst my disconnection.
Man, that's there's a lot of stuff that you didn't work through. I think we all do that. I think for me, when things have not gone my way, when I feel like, oh, I was passed over for something, and I'm telling myself different stories. And one of the things that you just said is, I'm going to forge my own path. I think that's the direction I lean towards, is when something doesn't go my way, it's like, okay, I guess it's on me. I need to do this. I'm all by myself. I'm going to forge my own path.
Mhm.
What were some of the steps to help you move towards, I know it took you a decade, but help you move back to saying, oh,
Yeah.
I may need some more connection,
Yeah.
and healing and revealing of what really was going on there?
Yeah. I mean, most people can probably identify with this. It was pretty mixed. On the one hand, I think I was engaging in ways where I was disconnecting and sabotaging. In other ways, I mean, that note on my laptop that I found was during a season where I was leading retreats and I was inviting people to do the work of reconnection with God. And so it just shows how contradictory I am. We all are, right, at some level. But I think what ended up happening was I had this sense that there's something off. There's inside, it's not comfortable to live with self-alienation, to feel sort of out of body. And it was showing up in my body in anxiety. And I think I was coping with too much coffee in the morning and too much alcohol in the evening. And so I was using external things to regulate my nervous system. And then I put a lot on that second church that I worked at. So I moved from Orlando out to San Francisco, where I took another pastoral role, and I put everything into this role. Like it had to go well, because the last one ended poorly. And so I've got to be a superhero here. And by the way, people were responding with, wow, you are doing great. And so I was quickly sort of elevated into the senior leadership and given more responsibility. And I think that was taxing, because I was living with this sense of, as long as I'm doing well and as long as I'm kind of forging ahead, I can keep my deep shame and anxiety at bay. And I didn't have the kinds of relationships to be vulnerable, people to be vulnerable with. So I started in therapy. I did a bit of therapy, but I do think my body caught up with me. Yeah.
So then through that process, that if we don't realize we haven't actually dealt with some of our wounding, how do we start to pay attention to our body and feel and know what is going on? What does it look like to pay attention to our body and what our body is telling us?
Yeah. So, in some cases, in my case, you can't help but pay attention because you end up in the hospital. I think for those of us who are doing our work and the work I do continuously now, one of the things I talk about in the book is to pay attention to what I call the dashboard. The dashboard, of a car gives you a sense of what might be going on underneath the surface, right? Underneath in the engine. And how I imagine it, our personal dashboard has like 5 spots on it. It's like 5 different components to it: our thoughts, our emotions, our embodied sensations, our behaviors, and our interpersonal relationships, or sort of the quality of our interpersonal relationships. And and as I have people reflect on these things and they begin to write things down that I call, yellow lights on the dashboard or red lights on the dashboard, they'll begin to notice, like, yeah, my thoughts are very self-judgmental and self-contemptuous nowadays. My emotions, yeah, I'm feeling a lot of sadness, a lot of grief, a lot of shame. My body, I constantly feel like tired, or my body constantly gives me this sense of overwhelm. My behaviors, I am drinking too much, or I'm overeating, or numbing in particular ways. My relationships, I haven't had an honest conversation with my best friend in a long time, and I kind of pulled away. All people actually go through those 5 components and write those down, and those are pretty good indicators of what's going on beneath the surface. And so that's sort of an initial way. Oftentimes, if people are skeptical of this or think it's psychobabble, I'll go back to Psalm 38 and I'll say, David in Psalm 38, in pretty honest and explicit terms, actually names his thoughts, his emotions, his embodied sensations, his behaviors, his relationships, in a way that gives us permission to name ours.
Man, I think it's really important. And so then what is the role of now? I think because we've been wounded, we're in isolation a lot of times in disconnection through it. Then what's the role of others to bring us back to know what is going on under the surface? Because I could give you a bunch of symptoms, but I don't really know what's going on under the surface.
Yeah, I do think, that when we're in what we call dysregulation, which is sort of the embodied state that I'm talking about, this embodied state of disconnection, when our nervous systems are in a kind of coping mode, a survival mode, one of the surefire ways we know of getting back to a sense of regulation, to getting back home, as I call it, is through co-regulation. It's through 2 people meeting one another in an honest, connected, attuned kind of way, and the interesting thing about it, Joshua, is like you and I don't know each other, but I pretty quickly felt safe with you. I don't know what it is about you. Maybe it's because we're 2 middle-aged men trying to survive in the world. I don't know, but
it's the gray,
Yeah, the gray, but there's this immediate sense of safety, and I think when we feel a sense of safety with others, when you have a person in your life who can really attune to you, ask good questions, your body feels safe. There's this embodied sense of I can relax my strategies for survival, and when we do that, we enter into a state. I won't get into too much because it gets a little technical, but we enter into a nervous system state that's actually a state of safety. I call it the still waters of God, the green pastures of God, a place where we feel rooted and grounded in love. And from that place, actually, we know physiologically, neurobiologically, that we can heal. Our bodies can heal. And I'm talking about anything from chronic illness to anxiety disorders, and everything in between, and so our bodies have an innate capacity to heal. But when we are in a state that allows that healing to take place. So by the way, when I was in my state of alienation and disconnection, my body was in a, when they went in this hospital in Mexico to take out my gallbladder, the doctor said, "You are septic. Your system is septic. You have to stay in the hospital longer than we thought." My body was keeping the score. So clearly my body, there's a toll, a tax on my body from living in dysregulation and disconnection for so long.
My name is Father David, and I'm a Franciscan friar, and every week, me and my guests dive into some of the most pressing issues of our time: church and state, immigration, LGBTQ+, economic inequality, anxiety, depression, climate change, and so much more. Join us in these conversations. Friar Time isn't just another podcast, it's where faith meets real life head on. You can find all the links to our podcast channels in your show notes.
So I think part of that is being finding an empathetic listener. If you can find somebody that's empathetic that could listen, one of the things that I know we have done, my wife and I lead a missions organization, and we deal with some traumatic issues, and we've done a lot of critical incident stress debriefs.
Yeah.
So just after a really traumatic event that happened. So, a couple in our home church had somebody break into their house that was there for 30 minutes. They had to go out on their roof. She was 8 months pregnant. And it was just a scary time. The police didn't come for a long time. And so my wife went over and, just that evening listened to the whole story.
Yeah.
What is the importance of actually having somebody to sit there and listen and be an empathetic listener?
Yeah, that's hugely important, because that's where that co-regulation happens. That's where that sense of feeling mirrored, feeling attuned to happens. This is a biological inheritance, a spiritual inheritance. We need attunement. We know in our earliest hours, we need, as we emerge from our mom's wombs, we need to be held. We need to be loved. A baby can't survive without connection. And so this is a birthright. Connection is a birthright. And the wild thing is so many of us live disconnected for so long, right? And so what your wife did was, I'm sure she showed up in a way that provided that kind of attunement. Now where therapist Chuck gets curious then is your wife bears some secondary trauma, perhaps from sitting with. I can imagine the ministry that you've done and what your bodies have absorbed. And even if you haven't absorbed it directly, there are those of us who do the work of helping where we absorb a kind of secondary or adjacent trauma, and we begin to notice symptoms. We get kind of numb. We're not as, we don't feel as much. We get depressed. We pull away. And so all of those things are things to pay attention to as well.
Exactly. You get to listen, you get to take things, and then you have to give it away. And you also have to say, hey, and have somebody to be able to listen to you. And that's been crucial to us in our lives. And we need that. I think part of us growing up and the woundings that we have, you talk about in one of the chapters in your book, you talk a lot about attachment theory and the different disordered attachments that we do have, or the secure attachment that we do have. What is attachment theory? And the steps there, and why is it important that we actually recognize where we are in the midst of that?
Yeah, well, we just sort of hinted at it. We're designed for secure attachment. We're designed to be seen, known, loved, delighted in. Oftentimes, I'll talk about the image of God in terms of three things: a sense of worth, belonging, and purpose. And that's something that comes, that emerges out of the beauty of good, secure attachment. But the reality is we are born into a broken world and into broken relationships. My parents married in 1956. I was born in 1970. And there was a lot of addiction and talk of divorce and counseling, but counseling back then wasn't very good. There were miscarriages. There was just a lot of pain. So I was born into a lot of pain, and I was also born to be the hero that would save my parents' marriage. I was born to be the glue. That's a lot to absorb. And so I grew up with a mixture of anxious and avoidant attachment, which is to say, the anxious storms of my mom's dysregulation. She didn't want to lose another baby. She loved me, and yet she probably operated with too much control. My dad's distance and avoidance. And so I was constantly craving more connection with him. And so I emerged into adulthood with this kind of mixture of anxiety. I need love. I want you to like me. I'm going to pursue it. And avoidance. No one's really going to love me anyway, and I'm never really going to amount to anything. And so there was shame. And by the way, I went to seminary at 25 and no one was talking about this stuff. And so it was all about just figuring out your theology and performing well, right? And so, boy, that's just a scary cocktail for the formation of a pastor, right? And so my anxious and avoidant attachments led me to some of those things showed up in the early years of my marital relationship, of course, and my friendships, where I was constantly operating out of a push-pull of an anxious kind of tug. Do you like me? Will you be my friend? Am I doing okay? And an avoidant pulling away. I guess I'm just better on my own. I better just kind of protect myself in this way until I started doing my own work, until my counseling professor in seminary said, dude, you got work to do.
You got a lot of work to do. Let's work on it.
Said to me, if you don't do your work, you'll be dangerous.
Wow. So if you have avoidant detachment or attachment, of course, detachment. That is the actual word that should be used right there if you're avoidant.
Yeah.
But if you do have these different attachments that are avoidant or anxious, is there a way to start to heal those things and get to a place of you feel like you have secure attachment in the world and you're able to be connected to others again and find joy in the midst of your life?
Yeah. So what I also say about attachment is with secure attachment, we gain a sense of ourselves. We have a stronger sense of who we are. We have a sense of authenticity as well. I call it the sense that I connected to purpose with the image of God. Like when mom and dad are connected to us, they'll champion our voice in the world, our place in the world, to quote Michael W. Smith. And so an old song that we would remember. And so there's this sense of I'm loved and I can enter into the world with confidence. And when you don't have that secure attachment, well, you're going to be looking for, you're going to be chasing after, you're going to be chasing, as I often say, chasing after worth and belonging and purpose. Now, how do we discover secure attachment as adults if we find ourselves disconnected? Well, we find our way to secure attachment in a therapist, a friend, a pastor, a spiritual director, a mentor, someone that provides that kind of secure space. I do this with folks all the time. I just spent 2 hours before our time with clients of mine as a therapist where I get to create a space for 50, 55 minutes where they're held and they're known and they're seen, all the things that we longed for, and didn't get. And we can find our way back there. I'm really grateful in my earliest days to sat with a man named Roger Shepard who provided that space for me. And I remember just feeling like there's something here. There's a sense that I'm known here and a safety that I feel here that I've never experienced in any other relationship. And he's allowing me to sort of grow up and make some mistakes. And he's, and so we're sort of working through some things like developmentally even that we didn't work through when we were younger, so there's oftentimes with attachment, we say that we can experience earned secure attachment, which is to say that through the work that we do of experiencing the kind of co-regulation, safety, delight, work, all those things, belonging that we needed, that we can find our way back to some sense of secure attachment.
So you're saying there's hope for us. We can
No,
get
I'm not
there.
saying there's hope for you.
Okay.
No,
I didn't think there was hope for me.
Yeah.
I was talking about other people.
Yeah, there's hope. There's lots of hope, and I think, that's what, I wouldn't be doing what I do, in my pastoral roles and my counseling and even at teaching in a seminary program here, if I didn't think that this would amount to us experiencing a deeper sense of delight in God, from God in our relationships. Yeah, there's hope.
That's good. One of the things that you talked about, both in your attachments, after your wounding, you were telling yourself a certain type of story.
Yeah.
And we always tell ourselves we're probably
Yeah.
our harshest critics, on the inside.
Yeah.
We're telling ourselves stories.
Yeah.
How do we get back to a better story? A story where it actually more reflects what
Yeah.
God sees in us than what we
Yeah.
see in us.
Yeah. Yeah. This reminds me of, I tell the story in there of Isaiah chapter 30, where Israel, who, is in a pretty vulnerable position, is sensing that Assyria is going to invade. And if Assyria invades, it's over. And so in their anxiety, they tell the story that we can't do this without help from Egypt. Egypt, ironically, the nation that had enslaved them, and they live into this very old story that prompts them to go back for help instead of going to God. And I had the sense that we live that out too. Like, there are old stories inside of me that, your dad was busy. He didn't take the time. No one really wants to take the time. You're not worth the time. Well, now I know my dad loved me, and I know that wasn't his heart, by the way, but that's what I internalized. And that's a very old story. Or for my mom, you're never going to get it right. And so I just have this sense that, shame is always kind of right underneath, simmering right underneath, and just about everything I do, that somehow, some way, it's not nearly like it used to be, but somehow, some way, even if after I get off with you, Joshua, there might be some sense of like, boy, there are 100 different ways that you could have done it differently, Chuck. And you could have said this, or you've done that. And think of all the people who are far more articulate than you are, and these are old wounds that have become stories that I tell myself. And I think part of why I introduced the 3 questions is to say, God is so kind and curious and compassionate and longs for you to know a better story. And I offer practices in there of embodying a better story as we remember, both in our own story and from God's story, where we've experienced worth and belonging and a sense of purpose.
So then what is a good practice for us? Like, I know you have practices at the end of every chapter, and it's fantastic.
Yeah.
A lot of great work that I could just do as I'm reading the book. So what's an example of a practice for us that we could get back to that better story?
Yeah. So one is that I practice that I call the timeline exercise. And it's simply you put a horizontal line down the center of a paper. And I'll do this as I do counseling with people, where below the line, the horizontal line, we'll think about how we experience woundedness around our sense of worth and belonging and purpose. And what I find is people have plenty of content for that. As mom and dad and coaches and pastors, all sorts of people in their lives, it's like, I didn't ever feel like I belonged. And I heard this message from my coach. But above the line, people are often surprised when I ask them, listen for whispers of worth and belonging and purpose in your story, throughout your story, even now. And they'll be like compelled to tears as they remember, there was this consistent presence of my grandma, and whenever mom and dad weren't around, grandma would be over and she'd babysit me, and I'd always know I was delighted in. We're prone, we know this, research has told us we're prone to remember what's wrong. We're prone to remember the negative. And so my now adult daughters remind me of this all the time when they say, Dad, I remember when you did this to us. And I'm like, but do you remember when I took you out to like ride go-karts and get ice cream? And no, I don't remember that, So I invite people to not just to listen for those whispers in their story, but from scripture too. Like invariably there are texts that people will listen for and hear that are deeply reassuring to them. Texts that remind them of God's delight. And I've got some embodied practices that I invite people into to just sort of sit with them and allow them to kind of get into their bodies in a way that allows them to experience it more deeply.
Yeah, I think I'll go back to the very beginning of what I was talking about, is that we compare our suffering to others, and we dismiss our suffering because it's not as bad as other people.
Yeah.
How do we let ourselves know or let others know that their story matters, their suffering matters as well,
Yeah.
and we don't have to compare?
Yeah. Yeah. I find this a lot. You know this. I've been involved in some work with churches around issues of church abuse, pastoral abuse, and trauma and things like that. And, I even tell the story, I think, in there of sitting with a group of people who had been a part of a large staff, and they were comparing stories, like you were just talking about. Well, oh, you were there for 5 years. I was only there for 2 months, and yours is far worse than mine. And uh, one of the things I said to them is our nervous systems actually don't compare. Um, all they do is they experience the stress that can become trauma in the absence of a compassionate witness. What we long for, what our nervous systems long for, is not comparison but connection. Let's let go of the details here, and let's really just hear one another. You may have been there for 2 months, but you had those interactions with that senior pastor that were incredibly damaging. Let's listen. It doesn't matter what she went through. If she went there we can listen to her, but we really want to attune to your unique story, because our nervous systems are very different, and the trauma will be imprinted in ways that are radically different in different people. And I've seen this over 25 years as a therapist. I'll have people who come in who've been through very similar experiences, but one story of abuse is not like another. So I need to honor the uniqueness of people's unique stories, their unique experiences of pain, their unique nervous systems. I'd say, I don't know if you've heard of this category, but a highly sensitive person, an HSP. I was a highly sensitive child. I'm a highly sensitive, not the highest sensitivity, but I think that plays a role in this. And so there's a unique cocktail, of human being that is Joshua and is Chuck that we need to honor.
I think this is good. And I think one of the things, I think everybody needs this book, and everybody needs to heal what is within them. But one of the things that we do here, my wife and I do a lot, so we train a lot of missionaries and, church planters in this world. A lot of times people are, how do I say this? They're actually reverting back to, they're actually using their woundedness to get energy for the work. So they're striving to go out to feel significance in something. And so they're trying to get their significance out of the good work that they do rather than the worth that they found in who they are and who God has created them to be. As we're training people for the long haul, especially for high capacity strivers, how important is this work, this healing work, and what difference is that going to make in our churches and our disciples down the road?
Yeah. That's such a good question. And there's so many different ways we can go. I'm just so glad you and your wife are so attuned to that reality, because it's often the case, if you've experienced challenges in ministries, even some trauma, some pain, that you're going to chase another exciting situation in an attempt to regulate your nervous system. I'm going to try again. Maybe I was doing that when I went out to San Francisco. I'm going to try again. I'm going to enter into this really challenging situation. I'm going to do it better. Really what we need to do in those kinds of situations is to slow down and to pay attention, first to that dashboard, and then underneath to the engine, to the autonomic nervous system, and the reality that we might be living on this kind of what I call sympathetic nervous system hamster wheel. I'll do these 5-day intensives with pastors and missionaries, and I'll draw it up on the board. Your nervous system was meant to be in this kind of centered place that I call home, the still waters of God. But you're living in the sympathetic storm, this hamster wheel, and you're chasing after other hamster wheels, other things that feel exciting or thrilling or life-giving or through approval seeking, whatever it might be, in an attempt to uh, uh, offer some sort of internal regulation, but you're never going to get it through the chase, whether it's some form of addiction or some sort of ministry workaholism. That's really challenging, as you know, because when your identity has been wrapped around performing or workaholism or whatever it is, to step off the hamster wheel, it's like, I don't know who I am without the hamster wheel. And so it takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of support. Oftentimes, when I'm working with pastors, it's like, there's no way, like my church sent me to you, Chuck, to get fixed so I could come back and exert the same energy or more than I was. And so it's really risky. And they'll often say, I'm not sure that I'll be able to keep my job if I do this. I've got a friend, Steve Smith, who founded Potter's Inn and the Soul Care Institute. He tells a story of pastoring this mega church and going to spend some time with Dallas Willard. And then after his sabbatical, he came back a different person and he realized, I can't pastor the way I used to, and it's just not going to work. Okay. So yeah, that's it. So yeah. So then you step into the next season of your life with hands open and with a great sense of awe and wonder as to what God might do.
I think in this day and age that we live in, we are more informed with mental health issues than we ever have been before.
Yeah.
We have more knowledge and more expertise in what is happening and what is going on. But there is higher levels of depression and anxiety than before as well.
Yeah.
How do we move from understanding the mechanisms of mental health into actually healing and moving forward into a space?
Yeah. So that's, gosh, you asked really good questions, and hard questions. And
yeah, I know it's hard, but that's why I want to ask it, because I think it's important.
What you're touching on is a major shift that I've experienced in 25 years of doing the work, where a lot of what we were doing was talk therapy for a long time, where we were talking about the issues and talking, using DSM diagnoses and talking about family stories. And we're recognizing more and more that we've got to engage practices that invite us to wholeness, that invite us to connection, that invite us to regulation. And that requires more embodiment than I was trained in such a long time ago. There's new research that is actually channeling what I think is an ancient understanding of the body and the breath that involves us finding our way back to the ground of our being, you might say, to use a philosophical phrase, or a sense of groundedness. I remember when I first started engaging some new practices after this ordeal in the Mexican hospital, I began slowing down. I began breathing, and it felt really strange because I had lived so dissociated from my own body. And it was like, oh, there's an arm and a hand and a foot and a heart. And wow, so how did I get here in the first place? And so this is where we can think about it. How did I get here to the point where I'm so disconnected, so dissociated from my body? How do I engage practices that allow me to re-engage with my body, with my breath, and to heal some of those deep wounds? And, I think we see this in seed form in Genesis chapter 3 when Adam and Eve hide. It's a way of coping, hidden behind fig leaves. We survive in ways that actually keep us functionally disconnected from ourselves, each other, and from God. But reconnection involves becoming embodied again. It involves practices of, oftentimes my clients know this, but very early on, we're rubbing our chests, we're practicing bilateral tapping, we're breathing, we're engaging some ancient prayer practices, sometimes contemplative prayer, certainly some early church readings and biblical readings where we're breathing in and breathing out. We're engaging lots of different practices to reconnect us to our bodies.
think that's so good. I mean, I've had people tell me, I've been, through tapping and different things with their body. I was like, I don't know how this works, but it does work, and it's great. And so I don't need to know that how it works, but I know that it does. And I think embodiment is really important, and I think that's fantastic. That the last time I was feeling disconnected and anxious, one of the practices that I felt like I was invited to was to take my shoes off and just go into the dirt and just be where I am.
Yeah.
And that helps so much, just actually being there and feeling my feet on the ground in the dirt.
Yeah.
It was like, hey, I am actually here. This is perfect.
Right.
Yeah.
I'll send my students, I'll know, 8 weeks into the semester that my students are pretty disconnected, right? I mean, they're just surviving the semester. And we've got this pine grove right next to the seminary grounds. And I know that they walk high speed through that pine grove to get from our campus to the coffee shop or wherever they go. And so I'll say, so here's what we're going to do for the next hour. You're going to slow down, maybe take off your shoes if they feel comfortable doing it, and walk in the grass, in the pine grove, slowly observing what you observe. Movement of the leaves, the flight of a bird. And some will come back in tears, like that palpable sense of, so we're talking about being out in nature now and slowing down and getting grounded, that palpable sense of I have been alienated from myself, disconnected from my own body, maybe even from my relationships. And that really slowed me down and invited me back home. And there are lots of different practices that can allow us to do this, both in contemporary psychology and in the ancient Christian tradition.
So is it, your definition of home, what is back home? Is it that sense of purpose and worthiness and belonging? Yeah. What is that? Where am I trying to head back towards?
Yeah, well, I think home, when I talk about home, I talk about it at multiple levels. I talk about it at a spiritual level, a physiological level. So at a spiritual level, some have called it the true self, a place where we feel centered, the still waters of God, where we experience feeling rooted and grounded in love, abiding in Christ. There are a variety of different metaphors. Well, we know in an embodied sense, well, in the contemplative tradition, that's where we use the language of the true self, that place where God's image dwells, where God dwells. In contemporary sort of trauma-informed physiological ways, neuroscientific ways, we talk about the ventral vagal system, which is the kind of the regulating center of our autonomic nervous system. It's home base. It's where we feel relaxed and grounded and creative and playful and at ease and connected. And so, when you're at home in your own house, like you've worked a long day and you walk in your house and you're just like, that feels good. We feel that at a physiological level, and these practices are geared toward shifting people's autonomic states from what I call sympathetic storm or dorsal fog, to use some technical terms of our autonomic nervous system states, to this ventral sense of home. Like, okay, I like this. I feel connected to myself. I feel connected to God. I feel like I can show up better in my relationships. I'm not prone to overeat. I'm not going to drink myself to numbness tonight. This is nice,
That's so good. I felt that last night after being gone for a couple of weeks. Like, I walked into my house. This is home.
Yeah.
And I felt so good just to sit there. One of the things that I've noticed as I've done this work of dealing with my woundedness and my wounds in my life is that when I react to something out of my woundedness now, that I am more aware of, like, oh, I did that because of my wounding. So I'm quicker to ask for forgiveness and to course correct and to move forward.
Yeah.
What is ongoing flourishing for us after we have started to deal with our wounds and
Yeah.
we know, what has been going on in our lives,
Yeah.
but how we could continually flourish
Yeah.
long term.
Yeah, I think you're getting at it. We begin to understand the landscape of our own soul. And in so doing, we understand that there are these detours that we take. There are these ways that we self-protect or we disconnect that are often very familiar. They're learned over the course of a lifetime in our early schools of formation with our moms and our dads. And so we notice that slight dysregulation as, we're empty nesters now. My wife and I were on a road trip a few weeks ago, and I noticed some avoidance, and it was kind of like, I need to pay attention to this. What's going on right now? We got in the car, we're driving, we're headed out, and I had to do the work, because if I wouldn't be paying attention, I'd probably just act out of that. I might have just stayed in that space for 2 or 3 days, but I wanted to notice what's coming up for me. And I did. I paid attention. I allowed myself. She didn't know this was happening. We were kind of driving along. She was taking a nap. I was, driving a few hours, and I had this sense of, there's some old stuff that has bubbled up, and it has to do with some anxiety around some things that are going on in our lives. And I want to be present. So I'm going to breathe, and I'm going to ground, and I want to honor, some parts of me that are feeling kind of fearful right now and overwhelmed. My daughter and her fiance were headed off to Japan. We've got a wedding we're planning, some things going on in our lives that feel disruptive, and honor those things and come back to a place of center. So I'm breathing. My wife's sitting over there napping, and I'm rubbing my chest, and I'm 4 seconds in, holding for 7 seconds, out for 8 seconds, breathing, praying this ancient prayer, calm me, O Lord, breathing in as you still the storm, breathing out, still me, O Lord, keep me from harm. I should have given you more warning before doing that. I didn't know I was going to offer you that prayer, but this old ancient Celtic prayer. And by the time she woke up, I was more grounded. I was just more there, and we were able to be together, be connected. But I'm growing to notice those things more. And then there are times where, my daughters or my wife call me out because I'm not noticing. And it's the same old duck that they're very familiar with, who gets really anxious or really disconnected.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that. That's so good. What a great example. I was able to read Healing What's Within while we were camping and fly fishing. So around a fire, it was a perfect spot to actually
Cool.
sit there and read your book. And while I was reading it, I was like, I want to give this. I just wanted just to hand out copies. So I was like, you need this. This is amazing. What is your hope for your readers? People would pick up your book. What would you want them to get out of it and implement in their lives?
Yeah. Well, I think I want them to experience an invitation to this transformation, this path of transformation that I lay out in the book. I want them to experience it as inviting, accessible, safe, not too complicated, not complicated by too much verbiage, from theology or psychology, but really just invitational and accessible. And as you know, there are practices, and there's a bit of a stair-step approach where we're layering some things in the book. We're becoming aware in the early chapters. By the middle chapters, we're paying attention a bit more to some of the complexity of our own stories. By the last chapters, we're looking at ways that we cope. I think if people can find their way into this inner conversation, I have a lot of hope for the healing that can happen. The problem is we stay pretty externalized. And as you know, I've done some writing on narcissism and spiritual abuse. And I know from my own story and other people's stories, we're looking for someone to blame. We're looking for how we might get justice. We're looking for some sense of control. I get it, because I've lived in all those places. But I had to do the work. I was compelled to do the work of turning my attention to the wounds that I carried within me that were unique to me. And that's the invitation in this book.
That's really good. I have a couple quick questions at the end. One, if you go back to your 21-year-old self, what advice would you give?
Man, I would almost just sit in silence with tears in my eyes and looking into the eyes of a young guy with so much anxiety, who's so disconnected and so scared at some level, and working really hard to belong. I think I just give him a hug and say, "You're loved. You don't have to try so hard. And God is more near than you can imagine, But yeah, that's a good question, man. You're
Thanks.
wow.
But I think that's so good, because I think even what you were doing in your road trip of saying, okay, I feel disconnected, I'm not attached, like I'm avoiding something here. Sometimes it takes a lot to get over that fear of, okay, I'm kind of scared to actually engage in this connection right now, but you actually did it. It's the same thing you were going to say. You talked about your 21-year-old self as someone who was fearful, of anxious.
Yeah.
And I think the work continues. Like you're not giving into fear. You're actually stepping into a place of hope and healing, even when it is scary. Because all of these things is actually putting yourself out there of saying, hey, I need some connection. Are you going to actually be there with me? So well done. Yeah. Next one, anything you've been reading or watching lately you could recommend?
Oh, yeah. Well, I've been watching the Euros and the Copa matches, but those are over now. I won't tell you who won if the readers. I'm reading a new book called The Secret Language of the Body that just came out that I think takes a next step in the inner work, the body work that I think I'm still learning on the go, and so many of us are learning. And of course, Bessel van der Kolk invited all of us to many years ago on The Body Keeps the Score. There's going to be more and more work like that coming out, I think, in the coming years as we understand the mind, heart, body connections and do that kind of work. So that's one I'm reading right now. I'm rereading a book that is really wonderful called Trauma Stewardship by a woman named I just blanked on her first name, but her last name is Lipsky. It's an old one. It was a bestseller, and it's one that I assigned for pastoral care class on secondary trauma, adjacent trauma, so that pastors and missionaries and counselors know what the toll of listening to these stories and being in these challenging situations. And so yeah, that's one I've gone back to, and I've been doing a little dabbling in a book that came out of a retreat that Henry Nouwen led on the prodigal son. It's a book called Home Tonight, Further Thoughts on the Return of the Prodigal Son. And I actually got to listen to that retreat on CD, if you remember what those were, but that's not available anymore, but it's been put into this really cool book. And I need a lot of Henry Nouwen in my life. So yeah.
Well, the first CD I ever bought was Go West, Young Man by Michael W. Smith, Place in This World, which you mentioned earlier.
Full circle, Joshua.
Come full circle. I remember that. How could people connect with you? Where would you want people to and go out, get your book, Healing What's Within?
Yeah. So is this going to come out before it's released in October?
Nope. It'll come out the week it releases.
Okay. So either way, my website is chuckdegroat.net, and the book will be available wherever you can buy books. I'm at Western Theological Seminary in Holland, Michigan, not Western in Portland. And I teach here, and so people can find me here if they'd like to. And I think that's it. On social media, where we're all just trying to survive.
That's right. We are trying to survive. That's good. Well, Chuck, thank you for this conversation. Fantastic. Your book is incredible. It's great. Yeah. I really recommend everybody go out and get Healing What's Within. So thank you for taking us
Yeah.
through your story and
Yeah.
helping us through reckoning with our own wounds and helping us heal from what we have been wounded with. So thank you,
Well, I
Chuck. It
mean,
was
well,
fantastic.
by the way, I've done a bunch of these with the narcissism stuff. You're really good at what you do, and you ask crazy good questions. So thank you so much for actually reading the book, number one, and asking
Yeah.
good questions. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. If you want to see more episodes like this, go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron of the show. You can help us produce more episodes so that we can see the body of Christ look more like Jesus. If you become a patron on patreon.com/shiftingculture, you will get early access to episodes. You will get episode guides. You will get bonus shows, hopefully, and more. So go to patreon.com/shiftingculture and become a monthly patron. Also, leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps us out and helps us find new listeners to the show. And just go and share this podcast with your friends, your family, your network, people that you think would enjoy it as well. Thank you again for listening to the show. I hope you have a great week.